I knew working for Dante Teresi was dangerous the moment I signed my contract in blood red ink. But I never expected the real danger would be falling for a man who saw me as nothing more than efficient furniture, until the night he found me in another man's arms outside that jazz club, and the gun he pulled wasn't pointed at me. Looking back now, I can see the signs I should have recognized. The subtle shifts in the air whenever he walked past my desk. The way his dark eyes would linger just a fraction too long on my face before he caught himself and retreated behind that impenetrable mask of indifference he wore like armor. But at the time, I was too busy being the perfect secretary to notice that my boss might have been slowly, methodically, falling apart over something as inconvenient as feelings. 18 months I'd worked for Dante Teresi. 18 months of managing his legitimate business empire while carefully pretending I didn't notice the bloodstains that occasionally appeared on his custom-tailored cuffs, the hushed phone calls he took behind closed doors in Italian, too rapid and furious for my limited understanding of the language, the way certain men would arrive at his office looking cocky and leave looking like they'd seen their own deaths in his coal-black eyes. I was good at my job. Excellent, actually. Because I understood the fundamental rule of working for a man like Dante. Invisibility was survival, and I had perfected the art of being precisely what he needed while leaving no impression whatsoever on his personal awareness. My uniform was gray, exclusively gray. Pencil skirts and silk blouses in every shade from charcoal to dove. My dark hair always twisted into a severe bun at the nape of my neck. My makeup subtle to the point of non-existence. My jewelry limited to a simple watch and the small diamond studs my grandmother had left me. I knew his coffee order by heart. Espresso, double shot, no sugar, served in the Italian porcelain cup he kept in his private office. And I knew his schedule better than he did, managing the complex choreography of his days with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony, ensuring that his legitimate business meetings never overlapped with the visits from men whose names appeared in no appointment books, and whose presence was never acknowledged in any official capacity. I knew that he preferred his shirts pressed with military precision, that he drank Macallan 25 when he was celebrating, and Leifrig when he was planning something that would haunt him later, that he had a scar along his left ribcage from a knife fight when he was 17, that his mother had died when he was 12, and he still kept her rosary in his desk drawer, though I'd never seen him pray. I knew everything about Dante Teresi, except what it felt like to have him look at me like I was a woman, instead of a particularly useful piece of office equipment, and I had convinced myself that this was exactly what I wanted, exactly what I needed to survive in his world, right up until the moment I realized I was lying to myself about something far more dangerous than his criminal enterprises. I was in love with my boss, desperately and stupidly in love with a man who barely registered my existence beyond my ability to manage his calendar and screen his calls. And the realization hit me one ordinary Tuesday afternoon when he'd rolled up his sleeves to examine a shipment manifest, and I'd felt my heart perform acrobatics that had nothing to do with professional admiration, and everything to do with the way the afternoon light caught the dark hair on his forearms and the flecks of muscle as he signed his name with that aggressive scrawl that matched his personality. That was 3 months ago, and I'd spent every day since then trying to suffocate these feelings, bury them so deep that even I couldn't find them anymore. Because I knew with absolute certainty that Dante Teresi was not a man who fell for his secretary, and I was not a woman who confused fantasy with reality. Which is why tonight was supposed to be about reclaiming myself, about remembering that I was Isadora Navarro, 28 years old, alive and young and something more than a ghost who haunted the edges of a dangerous man's life. I'd taken the evening off, something I rarely did because Dante's world didn't operate on a 9-to-5 schedule and emergencies had a habit of erupting at the most inconvenient moments. And I'd gone home to my tiny apartment in Chelsea and done something revolutionary. I'd dressed for myself instead of for invisibility. The dress was red, the kind of red that demanded attention. Silk that clung to curves I usually hid beneath conservative tailoring, with a neckline that suggested rather than revealed, and a hem that ended high enough on my thighs to feel dangerous. I'd left my hair down, letting it fall in dark waves past my shoulders, applied makeup with an actual hand instead of my usual efficient efficiency, painted my lips the same defiant crimson as my dress, and when I'd looked at myself in the mirror, I'd seen someone I barely recognized. A woman instead of a shadow. Someone who existed in full color instead of carefully cultivated grayscale. The jazz club was in the meatpacking district, all exposed brick and low lighting, and a saxophone that wailed like a broken heart. The kind of place where beautiful people went to pretend they were bohemian while drinking cocktails that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I'd chosen it deliberately, because it was exactly the kind of place Dante would never go. Too public, too unpredictable, too many potential witnesses and complications. And I'd felt safe there. Anonymous in my red dress among the Thursday night crowd, sipping an overpriced martini and letting the music wash over me like absolution. That's when I saw him walking through the door, and my heart had performed that same traitorous leap it did every time Dante entered a room, except this time, the man walking toward me with a smile splitting his face wasn't my boss. Wasn't the cold, controlled crime lord who barely knew I existed beyond my administrative capabilities. This was someone from my other life. My real life. The life I'd carefully compartmentalized away from everything to do with Dante Teresi and his dangerous world. Marco looked good, better than good. His photographer's eye evident in the way he'd aged into his features, turning the gangly kid I remembered into someone who moved with confidence and grace. And when he reached me, I'd thrown myself into his arms without thinking, without remembering where I was or who might see. Too caught up in the pure joy of having my baby brother back on American soil after 5 years of watching him risk his life in conflict zones halfway around the world. We'd spun there on the edge of the dance floor, his arms tight around my waist, my head thrown, back in laughter that felt like freedom. And I'd been so happy, so completely and utterly present in that moment of uncomplicated love, that I hadn't noticed the shift in the atmosphere, the way conversations around us had stuttered and died, the way the crowd had parted like the Red Sea. I'd noticed when Marco had gone suddenly still in my arms, his body tensing with an instinct honed in war zones, and I'd followed his gaze to the entrance where Dante Teresi stood frozen in the doorway, like a vengeful angel carved from marble and malice. The expression on his face was something I'd never seen before, something that made my blood run cold and hot simultaneously, a transformation from his usual controlled indifference into something raw and primal and utterly terrifying. Shock melting into betrayal, melting into a fury so pure and incandescent that I could feel the heat of it from across the crowded room. His dark eyes found mine with the precision of a sniper's scope, and I watched, his hand move inside his jacket, watched him reach for the weapon I knew he carried always. And in that crystallized moment of absolute clarity, I understood with devastating certainty that Dante Teresi was not seeing his efficient secretary enjoying an evening off. He was seeing a woman who belonged to him in some possessive, primal way he'd never acknowledged, wrapped in another man's arms, and the civilized veneer he wore so carefully was cracking to reveal something savage underneath. The crowd sensed it too, that sudden spike of danger that made the air taste like copper and electricity, and people began moving away from us with the unconscious instinct of prey, animals recognizing a predator, creating a clear path between where Marco and I stood frozen and where Dante had begun moving toward us with the controlled grace of a hunting cat. I saw Luca Vitale materialize from the shadows, Dante's enforcer and closest friend, moving to block the exits with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, and I realized with a sick lurch in my stomach that this was about to become exactly the kind of scene Dante avoided, the kind of public spectacle that drew attention and created complications, except he was doing it anyway, because whatever he was feeling had overridden every strategic instinct he possessed. His focus was entirely on me, not on Marco, not on the crowd, just me. And there was something in his eyes that looked dangerously like possession, like betrayal, like I'd taken something that belonged to him and destroyed it in front of witnesses. Marco's arms had loosened around me, his voice quiet in my ear asking if I was okay, asking if I knew this man. And I could hear the tension in his question because my brother had spent 5 years in places where violence was currency, and he recognized the promise of it in Dante's approach. I managed to nod, managed to extract myself from Marco's protective embrace with a gentle hand on his chest and a whispered plea for him to stay calm, to let me handle this, because I knew Dante in ways my brother couldn't, knew that whatever was happening here was about to explode unless I could defuse it, and the only way to do that was to go with him willingly, to submit to whatever this was before it became a bloodbath in a jazz club full of innocent people who'd simply wanted to enjoy their Thursday night. Dante reached us before I'd fully separated from Marco, and up close his fury was even more devastating, radiating from him in waves that made my skin prickle and my breath catch. And when he spoke, his voice was so quiet, so carefully controlled, that it was more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "My office, now." 2 words that contained multitudes of threat and promise, 2 words that weren't a request despite being phrased as one. And I felt Marco tense beside me, felt him start to protest, felt the whole situation spiraling toward violence, so I did the only thing I could. I touched Dante's arm, felt the muscle jump beneath his expensive suit, and nodded my agreement before my brother could make this worse. I didn't look back at Marco as I walked toward the exit, didn't acknowledge the stares of the crowd, or the way Luca fell into step behind us like a silent guardian, just focused on putting one foot in front of the other and trying to understand what had just happened, trying to reconcile the cold, indifferent boss I'd worked for these past 18 months with the man who'd just revealed something raw and desperate and possessive in front of a room full of strangers. The night air hit my face like a slap, cold and clean after the close atmosphere of the club, and Dante's hand was suddenly on my lower back, guiding me toward the sleek black Maserati that waited at the curb like a mechanical panther. And I let him open the door and wait for me to slide into the leather interior before he closed it with controlled precision and rounded the car to the driver's side. Luca had disappeared, probably to manage whatever cleanup this scene would require, and it was just the 2 of us in the close confines of the car, the engine purring to life beneath us. And I tried to speak, tried to explain. But Dante cut me off with a single raised hand, his knuckles white where they gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set in a line that could have been carved from granite. We drove in silence through the glittering streets of Manhattan, and I watched his profile in the intermittent glow of streetlights, watched the muscle jump in his jaw, watched his hands strangling the steering wheel, and realized with a shock that ricocheted through my entire body that this wasn't about professional boundaries or inappropriate behavior or anything to do with the carefully constructed employer-employee relationship we'd maintained for 18 months. This was personal, devastatingly personal, and Dante Teresi was driving me to his penthouse instead of his office, taking me to the private sanctuary he'd never once invited me to enter. And I had no idea whether I was about to be fired or murdered or something infinitely more dangerous than either of those options. The elevator ride to Dante's penthouse felt like ascending into some rarefied atmosphere where normal rules ceased to apply, the numbers climbing higher and higher on the digital display, while the silence between us grew so thick and oppressive that I could barely breathe, could barely think beyond the thundering of my own heart and the terrible awareness of his body just inches from mine in the confined space, radiating heat and fury, and something else I couldn't quite name, but that made my skin feel too tight and my blood run hot despite the air conditioning that whispered through the elevator car. I'd never been to his private residence before, had never even known exactly where he lived beyond a vague awareness that it was somewhere in Tribeca, somewhere exclusive and expensive and utterly removed from the world where normal people like me existed. And the fact that he was bringing me here now, in this state of barely controlled rage, felt significant in ways I couldn't fully process, like crossing some invisible boundary that once traversed could never be uncrossed. The doors slid open directly into his penthouse, no hallway, no buffer between public and private, and I stepped out onto marble floors that gleamed like dark water, into a space that was all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Manhattan skyline like a painting. The city spreading out below us in a glittering sprawl of light and shadow that made me feel like we were hovering above the world, untouchable and isolated in this glass and steel eyrie. The furnishings were sparse but expensive, leather and chrome and dark wood. Nothing soft or welcoming about the space except perhaps the view. And I realized with a strange pang that this was exactly what I'd expected from Dante Torrisi, a home that felt more like a fortress than a sanctuary, beautiful and cold and utterly devoid of anything personal or vulnerable. He moved past me without speaking, shrugging out of his suit jacket and tossing it over the back of a chair with uncharacteristic carelessness, and I watched the play of muscles beneath his white dress shirt, watched him cross to the bar and pour himself 3 fingers of amber liquid that I recognized as his Lafroige, the whiskey he drank when he was planning something dark. And my stomach twisted with apprehension and something else, something that felt dangerously like anticipation. He didn't offer me a drink, didn't acknowledge my presence at all for long moments while he stood with his back to me, staring out at the city lights, and I remained frozen near the elevator, uncertain whether I should speak or stay silent, whether I should try to explain or wait for him to break first, and the tension stretched between us, like a wire pulled taut enough to sing. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was devastating in its controlled fury, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made me want to simultaneously run toward him and away from him. And when he spoke, his voice was so quiet, so carefully modulated, that it was infinitely more terrifying than if he'd shouted, "Who is he?" The question hung in the air between us, deceptively simple, loaded with implications and accusations and a possessiveness that made my breath catch because Dante had never, not once in 18 months, spoken to me with anything resembling personal interest, had never asked me about my life outside his office, had never indicated that he saw me as anything more than an efficient machine that managed his schedule and anticipated his needs. I opened my mouth to answer, to explain, but he continued before I could form words, his hand tightening around his glass hard enough that I worried it might shatter, his jaw working like he was physically restraining himself from saying something he couldn't take back. "How long have you been seeing him, Isadora?" The use of my full name instead of the abbreviated Izzy that appeared on all my office correspondence felt intimate and strange, felt like he was peeling back layers I'd carefully constructed. And there was something in the way he said it that made it sound like an accusation, like my name itself was evidence of some crime I'd committed against him. I found my voice finally, though it came out shakier than I wanted, less controlled than the professional tone I'd cultivated so carefully in his presence, and I could hear the edge of anger creeping into my words because who was he to demand answers about my personal life? Who was he to look at me like I'd betrayed some unspoken agreement we'd never made? Who was he to bring me to his private sanctuary and interrogate me like I was one of his soldiers who'd stepped out of line? "You have no right to ask me that," I managed, lifting my chin in defiance even as my heart hammered against my ribs, even as some treacherous part of me thrilled at the barely leashed possessiveness in his tone, at the evidence that maybe, possibly, I wasn't as invisible to him as I'd believed. "My personal life is my own, Dante, and what I do on my own time, who I see, I stumbled over the words, over the implications he was making, over the assumption that what he'd witnessed was romantic rather than familial, and I saw something flash in his eyes that might have been pain before it was swallowed by renewed fury. He moved then, crossing the distance between us with the predatory grace that had always been part of his appeal, that dangerous elegance that reminded everyone who saw him that beneath the expensive suits and legitimate business dealings was something fundamentally untamed, and I found myself backing up instinctively until my spine hit the cool glass of the floor-to-ceiling, windows, the city lights spreading out behind me like a galaxy, while Dante caged me in with his hands braced on either side of my head, his body close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell his cologne and the whiskey on his breath and something else that was just fundamentally him. "No right?" he repeated, his voice dropping to something that was almost a growl, something that resonated in my chest and lower, and his eyes were searching my face with an intensity that made me feel stripped bare, vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety, and everything to do with the emotions I'd been so carefully hiding. I have no right to care that my secretary, the woman who knows every detail of my life, who has access to information that could destroy me, is sneaking around with some man I've never vetted, never investigated, some stranger who could be using you to get to me? The words hit like physical blows, each one landing with precision, and I felt anger surge through me hot and righteous because, of course, that's what this was about. Not me, not any feelings for me as a person, but his paranoia, his need to control every variable in his carefully ordered world, his inability to tolerate anything that might represent a security risk. "Is that what you think?" I demanded, my hands coming up to shove against his chest even though he didn't budge, didn't give me an inch of space, his presence overwhelming and inescapable. That I'm what? Selling your secrets? Conspiring with someone to bring you down? After 18 months of loyalty, of keeping your confidences, of managing your life and never once betraying your trust, you think I would... My voice broke on something that might have been a sob, or might have been frustrated rage, and I saw his expression shift. Saw something flicker in his eyes that looked almost like uncertainty, like he was hearing something in my words that he hadn't expected. "Then tell me," he said, and his voice had lost some of its hard edge, had softened into something almost pleading. Though Dante Teresi didn't plead, didn't show vulnerability, didn't let anyone see beneath the armor he wore. "Tell me who he is, Isadora. Because I walked into that club and saw you in his arms, saw you laughing with your head thrown back like he'd given you something precious, saw him holding you like he had the right to touch you. And I wanted to..." He stopped himself, his jaw clenching, his hands flexing against the glass on either side of my head. And I could see the war happening behind his eyes, could see him struggling with something he didn't want to name, didn't want to acknowledge. "Wanted to what?" I whispered, because suddenly this felt important. Felt like we were standing on the edge of something that would change everything if we had the courage to step off. And despite my anger, despite my hurt at his accusations, I needed to hear him say it, needed to know if the impossible thing I'd been feeling alone had somehow, against all logic and reason, been mutual all along. "What did you want to do, Dante? Pull your gun? Threaten him? Kill him for the crime of making me smile?" The words came out harder than I intended, sharp with all the months of invisible longing, all the nights I'd gone home to my empty apartment and tried not to think about my boss, tried not to imagine what it would feel like to have him look at me the way he was looking at me now. Like I mattered, like I was more than efficient furniture, like the thought of me with someone else was physically painful to him. "Yes," he bit out, and the admission seemed to cost him something, seemed to crack open some careful control he'd been maintaining, and his forehead dropped to rest against mine, his breath coming faster now, ragged and uneven in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Yes, I wanted to put a bullet in him for touching what's mine, and I know I have no right. I know you're not my possession. I know I have no claim on you beyond what's written in your employment contract. But seeing you like that, seeing you happy in another man's arms, it made me want to burn the whole fucking city down until there was nothing left but you and me, and the truth I've been trying to deny for longer than I want to admit." The confession hung between us, raw and devastating, and I felt something break open inside my chest, felt 18 months of careful professionalism shatter like the glass at my back, and before I could think better of it, before I could remember all the reasons this was a terrible idea, before I could talk myself out of the most reckless thing I'd ever done, I closed the distance between us and kissed him. Or maybe he kissed me. Maybe we met somewhere in the middle of that charged space between us. But suddenly his mouth was on mine and his hands were in my hair, pulling it free from what remained of my carefully constructed style, and I was fisting my hands in his shirt hard enough to pop buttons. desperate to get closer, to eliminate every inch of space between us, to confirm that this was real and not some fever dream born of too many lonely nights and impossible wants. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined in my weaker moments. It wasn't gentle or exploratory or tentative the way first kisses were supposed to be, but rather something consuming and desperate, like we were both trying to make up for 18 months of restraint in a single moment. Like if we could just kiss each other thoroughly enough, we could erase all the time we'd wasted pretending we didn't want this. His hands moved from my hair to my waist, pulling me against him with enough force that I gasped against his mouth, and he took advantage of my parted lips to deepen the kiss into something that made my knees weak and my head spin, and every coherent thought evaporate into pure sensation. I could taste the whiskey on his tongue, could feel the barely restrained strength in his hands, could hear the low sound he made in the back of his throat that vibrated through my entire body, and I thought distantly that I should stop this, should push him away and demand we talk about this rationally. But rational thought seemed impossible when Dante Torrisi was kissing me like I was oxygen and he'd been drowning. We broke apart finally, both of us gasping for air, our foreheads pressed together, and our hands still clutching at each other like we were afraid the other might disappear if we let go, and I could feel his heart hammering against my palm where my hand had somehow found its way inside his shirt, could feel the tremor in his muscles that suggested his control was hanging by a thread. "I'm in love with you," I whispered into the charged space between us, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside where I'd been hiding it even from myself, and I felt him go absolutely still against me, felt every muscle in his body tense like I'd struck him, and for a terrible moment I thought I'd made a catastrophic mistake, thought I'd revealed too much too soon, and he would pull away, and this fragile, impossible thing between us would shatter before it had a chance to become real. But then his hands were framing my face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the intensity of moments before, his thumbs stroking along my cheekbones, while his eyes searched mine with an expression so vulnerable, so completely unguarded, that it made my chest ache with the enormity of what I was seeing. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion, and I could see in his eyes that he needed to know, needed to understand the timeline of this thing that had apparently been destroying us both in our separate silences. "Too long," I admitted, my own hands coming up to cover his where they cradled my face, and I watched something like wonder cross his features, watched the hard edges of Dante Torrisi soften into someone I'd never seen before, someone who looked young and uncertain and almost afraid. Since that Tuesday when you rolled up your sleeves in the conference room and I realized I'd been lying to myself about what I was feeling. But if I'm honest, probably longer than that. Probably from the beginning when you interviewed me and I should have been terrified, but instead I was fascinated, drawn to you in ways that had nothing to do with the job and everything to do with the man behind the reputation. He kissed me again then, slower this time, thorough and claiming and tender in ways that made my eyes sting with unshed tears. And when he pulled back, his smile was something I'd never seen before, transforming his usually austere features into something almost boyish, almost vulnerable. "I've been in love with you since the day you corrected my Italian grammar in front of my capos, and didn't flinch when they laughed," he confessed, his thumb tracing the line of my lower lip while his eyes followed the movement with rapt attention. And I remembered that day, remembered the meeting where I'd pointed out that he'd conjugated a verb incorrectly, and the way his men had tried to hide their amusement behind coughs and cleared throats, remembered thinking I'd just signed my own death warrant, but refusing to back down, because the grammar error had been bothering me too much to ignore. You stood there in your gray suit looking like some avenging angel of proper syntax, completely unafraid of me, or my reputation, or the fact that people have died, for showing me less disrespect. And I knew right then that you were going to be either my salvation or my destruction, possibly both. The admission should have made me happy, should have filled me with joy at this mutual confession, at the revelation that I hadn't been alone in these feelings. But instead I felt a cold thread of dread work its way through my happiness, because we still hadn't addressed the fundamental problem, the man in the jazz club who'd started all of this, the assumption that had driven Dante to this point. And I realized with dawning horror that in the overwhelming intensity of the past hour, I'd completely forgotten to explain, forgotten to correct his misconception, forgotten that he still believed I'd been embracing a lover when the truth was so much more innocent and so much easier to resolve. "Dante," I started, pulling back slightly to create enough space to think clearly, to form coherent sentences that weren't just gasped against his mouth. But before I could continue, before I could explain about Marco and the misunderstanding that had catalyzed this entire evening, his phone buzzed with the distinctive pattern that I recognized as Luca's emergency signal, and I watched his expression shift from vulnerable and open back to the controlled mask of the Mafia boss, watched him transform before my eyes into someone who could compartmentalize even this, even us, when duty called. He pulled the phone from his pocket, his eyes never leaving mine, and I saw his jaw tighten as he read whatever message Luca had sent. Saw the flash of something that might have been regret or frustration cross his features before he tucked the phone away and returned his attention fully to me. "We need to continue this conversation," he said, his hands still gentle on my face despite the tension I could see creeping back into his shoulders. "But I need to know right now, before I have to leave and handle this situation. I need to know if what just happened between us was real, or if it was just adrenaline and confusion and proximity. Because Isadora, if I let myself believe this is real, and it turns out to be temporary, it will destroy me in ways that bullets and betrayal never could." The raw honesty in his voice made my heart clench, made me realize that beneath all his power and control and carefully cultivated danger, Dante Torrisi was just a man who'd been alone too long, who'd convinced himself he didn't deserve softness or love, or anything beyond the cold efficiency of business and blood. And I knew my answer would either break down the last of his walls or reinforce them so thoroughly that we'd never get another chance at this. "It's real," I promised, and I meant it with every fiber of my being, meant it despite all the complications and dangers and impossibilities that came with loving a man like him. And I watched relief wash over his features like a wave. "But Dante, about tonight, about the man in the club." "Tomorrow," he interrupted, pressing one more kiss to my forehead with devastating tenderness, before stepping back and beginning to reassemble his armor, straightening his shirt, and running his hands through his hair to restore some semblance of order. "Whatever you need to tell me, we'll talk about it tomorrow. But right now, I need you to promise me you'll stay here tonight, where I know you're safe, where Luca can post guards, and I don't have to worry about you going back to that club or seeing him again or doing anything that will make me lose my mind while I'm trying to handle business." There was a question in his eyes beneath the command, an uncertainty that suggested he knew he had no right to ask this of me, knew that what had just happened between us didn't automatically grant him authority over my movements or my choices. And I loved him a little more for that awareness, for the way he was trying to balance his protective instincts against his respect for my autonomy. But I also knew that if I left now, if I went home and left this conversation unfinished, the misunderstanding about Marco would fester and grow, would become something larger and more complicated than it needed to be, would poison this fragile new thing between us before it had a chance to take root and flourish. "I'll stay," I agreed, because I could see the genuine worry in his eyes, could understand that whatever emergency Luca had summoned him for was serious enough that he needed to focus, completely without the distraction of worrying about me. "But you need to promise me that when you get back, whenever that is, we're going to talk about everything. About what this means, about how we navigate it, about the man you saw me with tonight, and why you don't need to be jealous of him." Something flashed in his eyes at that last part. Something that looked like renewed suspicion, or perhaps hurt that I was still defending this mystery man, even after everything we'd just confessed to each other. And I realized too late that I should have just told him the truth right then. Should have explained about Marco instead of letting him leave with this unresolved tension hanging between us. but he was already moving toward the door, already pulling on his jacket and transforming fully back into the cold, controlled crime lord who ran an empire. And I knew from experience that once Dante shifted into that mode, there was no pulling him back until the business was handled. "Get some rest, Isadora," he said from the doorway, and his voice had returned to that professional distance that I recognized from the office. Though his eyes were still burning with everything we'd shared, still full of promises and threats and desires that made my skin feel hot. "There's a guest room down the hall, second door on the left, and anything you need should be in there, and I'll have someone bring you clothes for tomorrow if I'm not back before morning." He paused, his hand on the doorframe, and for a moment I thought he might come back, might cross the space between us one more time, but instead he just looked at me with an expression so intense it made my breath catch. "And Isadora? Don't leave. Because if I come back and you're gone, if you've gone back to him, I won't be responsible for what I do next." The door closed behind him with a quiet click that felt impossibly final, and I stood alone in his penthouse surrounded by glass and city lights and the lingering taste of whiskey and Dante on my lips, and realized that I'd just made everything infinitely more complicated by not explaining about Marco when I had the chance. By letting Dante leave still believing I had feelings for another man, still consumed by jealousy over a relationship that didn't exist. And I had no idea how long I'd have to wait before I could correct his assumption, before I could explain that the man whose arms had triggered this entire catastrophic, wonderful, terrifying evening was my brother, not my lover, and that the only man I wanted touching me, holding me, looking at me the way Dante had looked at me tonight, was the one who'd just walked out the door leaving me alone with a confession of love and a threatened promise of violence if I didn't stay exactly where he'd left me. I spent the night in Dante's penthouse unable to sleep, prowling through the cavernous space like a caged animal, while the city lights glittered below me, and my mind replayed every moment of the evening on an endless loop, analyzing every word spoken and unspoken, every touch and kiss and confession, trying to reconcile the cold, controlled boss I'd worked for these past 18 months with the man who'd pressed me against the windows and kissed me like I was the answer to questions he'd been afraid to ask. The guest room he'd directed me to was pristine and impersonal, decorated in the same austere style as the rest of the penthouse, all clean lines and expensive fabrics that had probably never been used, and I couldn't bring myself to disturb the perfectly made bed or use the marble bathroom that looked like something from an architectural magazine. So instead I'd changed out of my red dress, hanging it carefully in the closet like some kind of talisman of the woman I'd been when this night started, and wrapped myself in one of Dante's shirts that I'd found in what I assumed was his bedroom, the fabric still carrying his scent of expensive cologne and something darker, something that was fundamentally him. The sky was beginning to lighten over the East River, painting the horizon in shades of rose and gold that seemed almost obscene in their beauty, given the turmoil churning inside me. When I heard the elevator chime and the doors slide open, and my heart leaped into my throat because Dante was back, and I had no idea what version of him would emerge. The vulnerable man who'd confessed his love, or the cold Mafia boss who'd left with threats and commands, or some third iteration I hadn't yet encountered. I found him in the living room, his jacket gone and his shirt untucked and stained with something that might have been blood, though whose blood I couldn't tell and wasn't sure I wanted to know. His hair disheveled from what looked like frustrated hands running through it, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested his night had been as sleepless as mine, though probably for vastly different reasons involving violence and business and all, the dark things that happened in his world after the sun went down. He stopped when he saw me, his eyes traveling over my bare legs, and the way his shirt hung on my smaller frame, and I watched something flash across his face that might have been possessiveness or desire or some combination of both, but it was quickly shuttered behind the careful control that I recognized as his default armor against the world. "You stayed," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like wonder, almost like he genuinely expected to return and find me gone despite my promise. despite everything we'd confessed to each other in the heated moments before he'd left. And I realized with a pang that Dante Teresi had been abandoned or betrayed so many times in his life that trust, real, genuine trust, was something he struggled to accept even when it was freely offered. "I promised I would," I replied, moving toward him slowly like he was some wild thing that might bolt if I approached too quickly. And I could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. Could see the weight of whatever he'd dealt with tonight pressing down on him. And my first instinct was to offer comfort, to smooth away the tension I could see written in every line of his body. But I knew we needed to talk first, needed to clear the air about Marco before anything else could happen between us. "Dante, we need to discuss what happened at the club, what you saw, because you left here last night still believing something that isn't true. And I won't let this thing between us start with that kind of misunderstanding poisoning it before we've even had a chance to see what it could be." His expression hardened slightly, the vulnerable man from last night retreating behind walls of ice and suspicion, and I watched him cross to the bar and pour himself another measure of whiskey despite the early hour. Watched his hands grip the glass with enough force that his knuckles went white. And I knew he was bracing himself for whatever I was about to tell him, preparing for the possibility that my confession of love had been a lie, or a manipulation, or some kind of temporary insanity brought on by the intensity of the moment. "Then tell me," he said, his voice carefully neutral in that way that meant he was feeling too much and controlling it with iron discipline. "Tell me about this man who makes you laugh like that, who holds you like he has the right, who you're defending even now after everything we shared last night. Because I need to understand, Isadora. I need to know what I'm competing against, what I need to do to make you choose me over him." The pain in his voice, carefully hidden but still audible to someone who'd spent 18 months learning to read his moods and micro-expressions, made my chest ache with the realization of how deeply I'd hurt him by not explaining immediately, how thoroughly my silence on the subject had fed into every insecurity and abandonment wound he carried beneath his controlled exterior. "You're not competing with anyone," I said, crossing the remaining distance between us and taking the whiskey glass from his hand, setting it aside so I could take both his hands in mine, needing the physical connection to ground this conversation in something real and tangible. "Dante, the man you saw me with last night, the man whose arms I was in when you walked into that club, his name is Marco Navarro, and he's my brother. My baby brother who I haven't seen in 5 years because he's been working as a photojournalist in conflict zones all over the world, and last night was the first time I'd gotten to hug him, to see him alive and whole and back on American soil. And that's why I was laughing. That's why I looked so happy. Because my family was finally safe and home, and it had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with romance or relationships or anything that should make you jealous." I watched the words land, watched them penetrate the armor he'd constructed, watched his expression shift from guarded suspicion to dawning comprehension, to something that looked almost like embarrassment, and his hands tightened around mine like he needed the anchor of my touch to process what I'd just told him. "Your brother," he repeated, his voice flat with shock, and I could almost see him replaying the scene from the club in his mind, recontextualizing everything he'd seen through this new lens, understanding finally that the intimacy he'd witnessed was familial rather than romantic, that the threat he'd perceived had been entirely a creation of his own assumptions and insecurities. "The man I almost killed last night, the man I spent the past 8 hours wanting to hunt down and destroy, is your brother." There was no question in his statement, just a kind of horrified realization that made me want to laugh and cry simultaneously, and I squeezed his hands gently, trying to convey without words that I understood, that I wasn't angry about his jealousy, even though his reaction had been completely disproportionate to the actual situation. "You couldn't have known," I said softly, reaching up to cup his face with one hand, while the other remained tangled with his, and I felt him lean into my touch like a man starved for gentleness, starved for the kind of uncomplicated affection that had probably been absent from his life for far too long. I never told you I had a brother. Never mentioned my family because I keep my personal life separate from work. And you saw what you saw and jumped to a conclusion that seemed logical given the limited information you had. And while yes, your reaction was extreme and possessive and completely inappropriate, given that you're my boss and have no actual claim on my personal life, I also can't pretend that some part of me isn't thrilled that you cared enough to be that jealous, that you felt strongly enough about me to lose control in a way that I've never seen from you before. He pulled me closer then, wrapping his arms around my waist and burying his face against my neck. And I could feel the tension draining from his body like water. Could feel the relief and residual shame and overwhelming emotion making him tremble slightly against me. And I held him there in the growing morning light, stroking his hair and his back and murmuring nonsense reassurances while he processed the reality that he'd put himself through hours of torture over a misunderstanding that could have been cleared up with a single sentence, if only we'd communicated better, if only the intensity of the moment hadn't overridden rational thought and basic information exchange. I need to meet him, Dante said finally, his voice muffled against my shoulder, and there was something almost pleading in his tone, something that suggested he needed to confirm this truth with his own eyes, needed to see Marco and understand the relationship in a way that would finally put this particular demon to rest. I need to apologize for the scene I caused, for threatening him implicitly just by being who I am and showing up the way I did, and I need him to know that we're... He stumbled over the words, uncertain how to define what we were now, what we'd become in the space of a single night. Together, I supplied, pulling back enough to look into his eyes, to see the vulnerability and hope and lingering fear written across features that usually revealed nothing. And I watched something settle in his expression, watched him accept the label and everything it implied with a small nod that felt more significant than any grand declaration. We're together, and yes, you should meet Marco. You should meet him properly under circumstances that don't involve you looking like you want to commit murder. And I hope, that he'll understand once I explain everything. Once he knows that you weren't just some random psychopath who crashed our reunion, but rather my boss who I'm completely in love with, and who apparently feels the same way about me despite all the reasons this is complicated and potentially disastrous. Dante's smile was small but genuine, transforming his usually austere features into something almost boyish, and he pressed a kiss to my forehead that felt like a promise, like a benediction, like the beginning of something that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. When can I meet him? He asked, and I could hear the urgency beneath the casual question, could understand that Dante needed this resolved sooner rather than later, needed to clear this particular hurdle so we could move forward without the shadow of last night's misunderstanding hanging over us. Today, if possible, because I need him to know that I'm not a threat to you, that despite appearances and reputation and the very real violence I'm capable of, I would never hurt you, never use you, never be anything but grateful that you've somehow decided I'm worth the risk of loving. The raw honesty in his words made my eyes sting with tears. I refused to let fall. Made me realize all over again how much courage it must have taken for a man like Dante Torrisi to admit to feelings, to vulnerability, to needing another person in ways that went beyond the transactional relationships that probably dominated his world. I'll call him, I said, reaching for my phone which I'd left on the coffee table last night. But Dante caught my hand, his expression shifting into something more serious, more weighted with the practical realities that came with any relationship in his world, but especially one that involved his secretary, someone who already had access to his most sensitive information, and who would now have even more reason to be targeted by his enemies. Before you do that, before we take this any further, I need you to understand what you're getting into, he said, and his voice had taken on that careful, measured quality he used when discussing business, when laying out terms and conditions and potential consequences, though his hands remained gentle on mine, his touch contradicting the formality of his words. I'm not a good man, Isadora. Despite what happened between us last night, despite these feelings I have for you, and being with me means accepting that there are parts of my life that are dark and violent and completely at odds with any kind of normal relationship, means understanding that people will target you to get to me, that you'll need security and protection, and your freedom will be curtailed in ways that might eventually make you resent me. Means accepting that I've done things and will continue to do things that might horrify you if you knew the details. And I need to know that you're walking into this with your eyes open, that you're not romanticizing what it means to be with someone like me, because the reality is so much harder than the fantasy. His words were meant to warn me off, meant to give me an escape route before I was in too deep. But what he didn't understand was that I'd been living in his world for 18 months already, had been managing the aftermath of his violence, and covering the tracks of his illegal enterprises, and keeping his secrets with the same dedication I brought to every other aspect of my job. And while yes, being romantically involved with him would complicate everything, and put me in more danger than I'd faced as merely his secretary, I'd made my choice the moment I'd kissed him last night, had committed myself to this path with full awareness of where it led. "I know who you are, Dante," I said firmly, meeting his eyes with all the certainty I felt, needing him to understand that I wasn't some naive girl who'd stumbled into his world without understanding the cost of admission. "I've known for 18 months exactly what you do, what you're capable of, what it means to be part of your world even in the limited capacity of your employee, and I'm choosing this anyway, choosing you anyway, because whatever darkness exists in your life, I've also seen the man underneath it. The man who keeps his mother's rosary in his desk drawer and drinks himself sick when he has to order someone's death and treats his people with a loyalty and protection that most legitimate businessmen could never match. And I'm not afraid of your darkness, Dante. I'm only afraid that you'll decide I'm not strong enough to handle it and push me away to protect me from yourself." Something shifted in his expression then. Something that looked like wonder mixed with relief, mixed with a kind of desperate gratitude that made my heart clench. And he pulled me fully against him, his arms wrapping around me with enough force to steal my breath. And I could feel him shaking slightly, could feel the emotion he was struggling to contain, making his whole body tense with the effort of not breaking down completely. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, against my hair, his voice rough with feeling. And I could hear the truth in those words, could hear that he genuinely believed himself unworthy of the kind of uncomplicated affection I was offering, that some part of him was waiting for me to realize my mistake and run. And I knew that convincing Dante Teresi that he was worthy of love was going to be a long, difficult process that would require patience and persistence, and a willingness to weather his doubts and fears and self-sabotaging tendencies. "You don't get to decide what you deserve," I countered, pulling back enough to frame his face with my hands, to force him to look at me and see the conviction in my eyes. "I'm choosing you, Dante. I'm choosing this. And you don't get to argue with my choice or try to convince me I'm making a mistake, because I'm a grown woman who spent 18 months watching you from close enough proximity to know exactly what I'm signing up for, and if I can handle managing your criminal empire from behind a desk, I can certainly handle being your partner in life. So stop trying to scare me away and accept that you're stuck with me now, whether you think you deserve it or not." The kiss he gave me then was different from last night's desperate claiming. This was slower, deeper, more thorough, like he was trying to memorize the taste of me, trying to seal this promise between us with something more binding than words, and I melted into it. Let him lead me through the kiss until we were both breathless and shaking, and the morning sun was streaming through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold that made the moment feel almost sacred. When we finally broke apart, his forehead resting against mine while we both struggled to remember how breathing worked, I could see that something fundamental had shifted in him, that he'd accepted what I was offering even if he still doubted his worthiness to receive it. And I knew that whatever happened next, whatever complications arose from mixing our professional and personal lives, we would face it together rather than in the isolated silence we'd both been maintaining for far too long. "Call your brother," Dante said finally, his thumb tracing my lower lip with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence I knew his hands were capable of, and there was a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth that suggested he was already planning this meeting, already strategizing how to make the best possible impression on the brother whose approval suddenly mattered more than any business deal or territorial negotiation. Tell him I need to see him today, that I need to apologize and explain and prove to him that despite the absolutely insane way I acted last night, I'm not actually a threat to his sister's well-being. And maybe, if he's willing, he can help me understand how to be what you need. Because I've never done this before, Isadora. I've never let anyone close enough to matter, and I'm terrified that I'm going to fuck this up in ways that will hurt you and drive you away and leave me more alone than I was before I knew what it felt like to have you look at me the way you're looking at me right now. The vulnerability in his confession made me love him even more, made me realize that beneath all his power and control and carefully cultivated danger was just a man who'd been alone too long, who'd convinced himself that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. And I pressed a soft kiss to his lips before reaching for my phone, already composing in my mind how I would explain to Marco that the terrifying Mafia boss who'd looked ready to commit murder last night was actually the man I loved, the man I'd chosen despite all the risks and complications, and hoping that my brother would understand, would see past Dante's reputation to the man underneath, would give us his blessing even though I knew I'd pursue this relationship with or without it, because some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, and Dante Torrisi, damaged and dangerous and desperately in need of someone to see him as more than the sum of his sins, was absolutely one of those things. Marco's brownstone in Park Slope felt like stepping into a different universe entirely, all worn brick and neighborhood charm and the kind of casual warmth that seemed to exist in direct opposition to Dante's sterile glass penthouse. And I could feel the tension radiating from Dante as we climbed the steps to the front door, could see the way his hand kept drifting toward the gun I knew he carried beneath his perfectly tailored jacket, and I squeezed his fingers gently in silent reassurance, even as my own heart hammered with anxiety about how this meeting would unfold. I'd called Marco earlier, had tried to explain in halting, inadequate sentences that the man from the club wasn't dangerous, or rather, that he was dangerous, but not to me, never to me, and that we needed to talk, needed him to understand something important. And my brother had agreed with the kind of patient bemusement that suggested he'd already figured out most of the story from my stammering explanation, and was simply waiting for me to catch up to what he'd already intuited about the intensity crackling between Dante and me last night. The door opened before we could knock, and Marco stood there in jeans and a faded t-shirt from some journalism conference, his photographer's eyes taking in everything about us in a single comprehensive sweep. The way Dante stood slightly in front of me, in an unconsciously protective stance. The way my hand was wrapped around his arm. The slight wrinkle in Dante's usually immaculate shirt that suggested I'd been the one to dress him this morning after we'd finally made it to his bedroom and discovered that talking wasn't the only way to communicate the emotions that had been building between us for 18 months. My brother's expression shifted from cautious wariness to something that looked almost like understanding, and the smile that broke across his face was genuine and warm and completely devoid of the judgment or concern I'd been afraid to see there. And I felt something tight in my chest loosen just slightly as he stepped back to let us enter his home. "So you're the reason my sister looked like she was about to have a heart attack on the phone this morning," Marco said, extending his hand to Dante with the kind of casual confidence that came from spending years in war zones where posturing meant nothing, and genuine character meant everything. And I watched Dante take the offered hand with something that looked almost like relief, his grip firm but not aggressive, his usual intimidating presence tempered by what I recognized as genuine remorse for the scene he'd caused last night. "I have to admit, when you showed up at the club looking like the angel of death, I thought I was going to have to protect my sister from some psychotic ex-boyfriend, but Izzy's explanation this morning, garbled as it was, made me realize I'd completely misread the situation, misread you, and I owe you an apology for the assumptions I made about your intentions." The generosity in Marco's words seemed to catch Dante off guard, and I watched him struggle for a moment with how to respond, watched the carefully constructed social masks he wore flicker and shift as he tried to find the right tone for this unprecedented situation, because I doubted very much that Dante Teresi had ever had to meet a girlfriend's brother before, had ever had to navigate the delicate social dynamics of family approval and relationship legitimacy. "I'm the one who owes you an apology," Dante said finally, his voice carrying that careful control that meant he was feeling too much and managing it with iron discipline, and his free hand, the one not being shaken by Marco, found mine and held on, like I was the only thing keeping him anchored in this unfamiliar domestic scene. "I saw your sister in your arms last night, and I reacted with a jealousy that was completely inappropriate, given that she's my employee, and I had no claim on her personal life. And I came very close to doing something that would have been unforgivable, would have hurt Isadora in ways I never want to hurt her. And the only excuse I have is that I've been in love with her for longer than I was willing to admit even to myself, and seeing her happy with someone else, even though that someone turned out to be you, her brother, which I would have known if I'd bothered to ask questions instead of making assumptions. It made me temporarily insane in ways that I'm not proud of." Marco released Dante's hand and looked at me with raised eyebrows that eloquently communicated a dozen questions and observations, and I could read in his expression the same analytical assessment he probably applied to his photojournalism subjects, trying to see past the surface to the truth underneath, trying to determine if this powerful, dangerous man standing in his living room was genuine in his feelings for me, or if this was some elaborate manipulation that would end with me hurt and broken. "He's telling the truth," I said softly, answering the unspoken question in my brother's eyes, and I felt Dante's hand tighten around mine in what might have been gratitude or surprise that I was defending him so openly, so completely, without reservation or qualification. About all of it, the jealousy, the inappropriate reaction, the being in love with me for longer than he wanted to admit. And I know this is complicated, and probably seems completely insane given that he's my boss, and there are 1,000 reasons this shouldn't work. But Marco, I love him too. I've loved him for months, and tried to deny it, because I thought it was impossible, and inappropriate, and completely one-sided. And last night when everything exploded, it was terrible and wonderful all at once, and I need you to understand that I'm choosing this, choosing him, with full awareness of what it means and what it costs. My brother's expression softened at my confession, and he gestured for us to sit on the worn leather couch that dominated his small living room, settling himself into the armchair across from us, with the ease of someone who'd learned to make himself comfortable in far more hostile environments than his own home. "I spent 5 years photographing people in the worst moments of their lives," Marco said, his voice taking on the thoughtful quality that meant he was choosing his words carefully, weighing each one for maximum impact and clarity. "And one thing I learned in all those conflict zones, in all those moments of violence and desperation and human nature stripped down to its rawest form, is that love doesn't follow logical patterns, doesn't conform to what's appropriate or safe or sensible, and the people who wait for the perfect circumstances to pursue what they feel end up alone and bitter and full of regrets about chances they didn't take." He looked directly at Dante then, his gaze steady and assessing in a way that made even my dangerous Mafia boss sit up a little straighter, made him meet my brother's eyes with the kind of respect he usually reserved for equals or worthy adversaries. "I don't know you, Mr. Teresi, don't know anything about you beyond what I could observe in those few charged moments at the club, and what Izzy has told me this morning, but I know my sister, know that she's not the type to make impulsive decisions or throw herself into situations without understanding the consequences. So if she's telling me that you're worth the risk, that you're worth upending her carefully ordered life for, then I'm inclined to trust her judgment even if every protective instinct I have is screaming at me to get her away from a man who showed up at a jazz club looking ready to kill someone over a perceived slight." The acknowledgement of Dante's dangerous nature didn't seem to bother my brother. If anything, there was a kind of recognition in his eyes that suggested he understood that particular brand of intensity, had probably encountered it in the warlords and militants he'd photographed over the years, had learned to see past the violence to the human being underneath. And I watched Dante process this acceptance with something that looked almost like wonder, like he'd expected rejection or demands or protective threats, and instead was being offered something far more valuable. Trust. Provisional and cautious, perhaps, but trust nonetheless. "I can't promise I'll never hurt her," Dante said quietly, his honesty stark and unflinching in a way that made my chest ache because he could have lied, could have offered pretty reassurances and false promises. But instead he was giving Marco the truth, even though it might cost him this tentative approval. "My world is violent and complicated and full of people who would use anyone I care about against me, and being with me means Isadora will be in more danger than she would be if she stayed sensibly uninvolved. Means she'll see sides of me that might make her question whether I'm worth the cost. But I can promise that I will protect her with everything I have, that I will never take her for granted, or treat her as anything less than the extraordinary woman she is, and that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift she's giving me by choosing to stay, despite all the reasons she should run." Marco studied Dante for a long moment, his expression unreadable in that way he'd probably perfected while navigating complex political situations in foreign countries. And then his face broke into a smile that transformed his features from cautiously assessing to genuinely welcoming. And he stood and crossed to where we sat, extending his hand to Dante again, but this time with a warmth that suggested acceptance rather than mere politeness. "Take care of my sister," he said simply. And there was weight behind those words, a promise and a threat wrapped together in a way that made clear that Marco might understand the necessity of Dante's world, but would never forgive him if he allowed that world to destroy me. And I watched Dante take my brother's hand and nod with a solemnity that suggested he understood perfectly the covenant being offered, the permission being granted, with conditions that were non-negotiable. The rest of the morning passed in a strange domestic tableau that I never could have imagined. My Mafia boss boyfriend and my photojournalist brother drinking coffee at Marco's kitchen table while I made breakfast with ingredients scrounged from my brother's poorly stocked refrigerator, the conversation flowing from stilted formality to something approaching genuine warmth as they discovered unexpected common ground in their shared experiences with violence and moral complexity and the weight of making decisions that affected other people's lives. I watched them from my position at the stove, watched Dante relax incrementally as he realized that Marco wasn't going to judge him or demand he be something other than what he was. Watched my brother's protective skepticism transform into cautious approval as he recognized the genuine emotion beneath Dante's controlled exterior. And I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't even realized was unsettled. The fear that I would have to choose between my family and the man I loved. That loving Dante would cost me the brother I'd only just gotten back after 5 years of worry and distance and prayers that he would survive whatever war zone he'd embedded himself in this time. When we finally left Marco's brownstone hours later, stepping back out into the bright afternoon sunshine with promises to have dinner together soon, and Marco's dry observation that he expected to be informed of any major life developments before they became accomplished facts. Dante pulled me close against his side as we walked toward his car, his arm wrapped around my waist in a gesture of possession and protection that would have irritated me coming from anyone else. But from him, felt like coming home. Felt like safety and belonging and the beginning of something that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. And I knew that whatever happened next, whatever complications arose from navigating a relationship with my boss, whatever dangers emerged from being connected to a man like Dante Teresi, whatever challenges we would face in learning how to be partners instead of employer and employee, we would face them together. And that made all the difference. The drive back to Manhattan felt different than any journey we'd taken before. The familiar streets and bridges transformed by the weight of everything that had shifted between us in the span of less than 24 hours, and I watched the city unfold through the windows of Dante's Maserati while his hand rested on my thigh with a possessiveness that had become somehow natural, despite the fact that yesterday at this time I'd still been pretending I didn't notice the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking, still been maintaining the careful fiction that I was nothing more than his exceptionally competent secretary. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of weighted quiet that came after emotional upheaval, after confessions and revelations and the fundamental restructuring of everything we thought we knew about ourselves and each other. And I could see in the set of Dante's jaw and the way his fingers flexed against my leg that he was processing everything that had happened with Marco, trying to integrate this new reality where he was accountable not just to himself and his organization, but to someone who cared about me, someone who would hold him responsible if he failed to protect me from the dangers inherent in his world. When we pulled up to his building in Tribeca, I expected him to suggest going upstairs to his penthouse, to continue the conversation we'd been dancing around all morning about what came next, about how we would navigate the treacherous waters of being both colleagues and lovers. But instead, he turned to me with an expression so serious, so weighted with something that looked almost like fear, that my breath caught in my throat as I waited for whatever he needed to say. "I need you to understand something before we go any further," he began, his voice carrying that careful control that meant he was managing emotions too large and complicated to express easily, and his hand found mine where it rested in my lap, lacing our fingers together with a gentleness that contradicted the tension I could see in his shoulders, in the muscle jumping in his jaw. "What happened between us? What's happening between us? It changes everything. Changes the fundamental dynamic that made our professional relationship work so well, and I need to know that you're prepared for what that means, for the fact that you can't be my secretary anymore, in the traditional sense, because I won't be able to maintain appropriate boundaries, won't be able to keep the professional and personal separate, when all I want to do when I see you is this." He pulled me across the center console then, ignoring the awkwardness of the angle and the gear shift digging into my hip, and kissed me with a thoroughness that made my head spin and my heart race, and proved his point more effectively than any explanation could have, because there was nothing professional about the way his hands tangled in my hair, or the way I melted against him, or the small sound that escaped my throat when he finally pulled back, just far enough to rest his forehead against mine. "I want you as my partner," he continued, his breath hot against my lips, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that suggested my answer mattered more than any business deal or territorial negotiation ever could. "Not just romantically, but in every sense of the word. I want you beside me when I'm making decisions. Want your insight and your moral compass and your ability to see through the bullshit that everyone else is too afraid to call out. Want you to be the person who keeps me honest and reminds me that there are lines I shouldn't cross no matter how expedient it might be to do so. And I know that's asking you to take on even more risk than you've already accepted by agreeing to be with me. But I also know that you're the only person I trust enough to let that close. The only person who's seen my darkness and stayed anyway." The proposal, because that's what it was, even if he wasn't offering a ring or a traditional commitment, made my eyes burn with tears I refused to let fall, made me realize that Dante Teresi was offering me something he'd probably never offered anyone else. True partnership. True equality, true integration into every aspect of his life in ways that went far beyond the administrative role I'd been filling. "Yes," I said simply, because anything else would have been insufficient to express the enormity of what I was feeling, the gratitude and terror and overwhelming love that came with being chosen by this complicated, damaged, extraordinary man. And I watched relief wash over his features like a wave, watched the tension drain from his shoulders as he processed my acceptance of everything he was offering, everything he was asking me to become. We went upstairs then, taking the elevator to his penthouse in silence that was charged with anticipation and promise. And when the doors opened into his sterile, beautiful space, it felt different than it had last night. Felt less like a fortress and more like a home, or at least the beginning of one. Because I understood now that Dante had been living in self-imposed isolation for so long that he'd forgotten what it meant to have someone waiting for him, someone who cared whether he came home whole or broken, someone who would smooth away the nightmares and hold him through the guilt and refuse to let him disappear into the darkness that constantly threatened to consume him. We talked for hours about the practicalities and logistics of our new arrangement, about how I would transition from secretary to true partner, about the security measures that would need to be implemented to keep me safe from his enemies, about how we would handle the inevitable speculation and gossip when people realized that Dante Teresi's untouchable, invisible assistant had somehow become the woman who stood beside him in public, who wore his ring and his protection and his heart in ways that made her both powerful and vulnerable. And through it all, I felt the rightness of this decision settling into my bones, felt the certainty that despite all the risks and complications and potential disasters waiting in our future, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. As the sun set over Manhattan and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed almost too beautiful for a city this hard and unforgiving, Dante pulled me onto his lap where he sat on the leather couch, wrapping his arms around me with a possessiveness that no longer felt threatening, but rather like safety, like belonging, like coming home after a long journey through territories hostile and unknown. "I'm still not entirely sure I deserve you," he murmured against my hair, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion, and the vulnerability that came from exposing parts of himself he'd kept carefully hidden from the world. "But I'm selfish enough to keep you anyway, to hold on with both hands and refuse to let go even when you realize what a disaster I am, even when the darkness gets too heavy, and you start to question whether love is enough to balance out everything else." His words were meant to sound resigned, perhaps even self-deprecating, but I heard the hope beneath them, heard the desperate wish that I would contradict him, would promise that I wasn't going anywhere no matter how difficult the road ahead became, and I shifted in his arms until I could see his face, could look directly into those dark eyes that had captivated me from the very beginning. "You don't get to decide you're not good enough for me," I said firmly, echoing the words I'd used earlier, but with an added layer of certainty that came from having survived our first real crisis, from having faced the jealousy and miscommunication and emotional chaos that could have destroyed us before we'd barely begun, and emerging stronger on the other side. "I'm choosing you, Dante Teresi, choosing you with full awareness of your flaws, and your darkness and your capacity for violence. Choosing you because beneath all of that I see a man who's capable of devastating loyalty, and surprising gentleness and a love so fierce it terrifies both of us. And I'm not going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow, not when things get hard or dangerous or complicated. So you might as well accept that you're stuck with me for the long haul and stop waiting for me to come to my senses and run." I punctuated my declaration with a kiss that started soft but quickly deepened into something that spoke of promises and possession and a future we were building together out of nothing but faith and stubborn determination. And when we finally broke apart, both of us breathless and shaking with the intensity of everything we felt, I saw tears tracking down his face that he made no effort to hide or apologize for, and I understood that these were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a man who'd been alone so long that being truly seen and chosen and loved felt like a miracle he'd stopped believing in. Looking back now, I can trace the exact moment my carefully ordered life tilted into something extraordinary. It was the moment Dante Teresi walked into that jazz club and saw me in another man's arms, the moment his control cracked just enough to reveal the man beneath the reputation, the moment jealousy and love and desperate fear combined to shatter every wall we'd both been hiding behind. And while yes, the circumstances were dramatic and messy and potentially disastrous, I wouldn't change any of it. Wouldn't trade the chaos for the safe, predictable existence I'd been living before. Because what we found in the wreckage of that misunderstanding was something infinitely more valuable than professional courtesy or careful boundaries or the illusion of safety that comes from never risking your heart. We found each other, really found each other, stripped of pretense and protection and the careful masks we wore to navigate a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. And in that raw, vulnerable space, we built something that was ours alone. A love that acknowledged the darkness while refusing to be consumed by it. A partnership that balanced power with tenderness. A future that promised nothing except the certainty that whatever came next, we would face it together. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.